The highest form of killing is to cause an accident. A man was getting ready to drive in his limited edition red Jaguar E-Type when he didn't realize the danger that was looming. He suddenly sees a white piece of paper on the passenger seat, opens it up, and can't help but scoff at its contents, just as fire breaks out. The protagonist makes a handsome entrance, and the real man never looks back. It's all so familiar to Arthur, no one knows who he really is. Even the women he's been with hundreds of times only learned his name when one asked. Arthur keeps a low profile because his job is dangerous. He must make targets' deaths look like accidents, requiring perfect precision. This profession, known as a mechanic, was what he did for a drug lord on his last mission, where dozens of bodyguards made the job nearly impossible. Even if swimming, there are bodyguards on the sidelines on sentry duty, and the water has been waiting for a long time. Swim for a while only to find his watch under the water. The drug lord subconsciously dived down to reach out to fish. The water suddenly sprang out of a black shadow dead center to pull him. The person is Arthur. Because in the water, the drug lord can only make gurgling water sounds. Outsiders simply cannot hear the sound of distress. Not a moment later, it stopped struggling. The bodyguards noticed something was off, but the boss was still swimming. Arthur controlled everything from the water. After reaching shore, he changed clothes in the tool shed. The mate screamed upon seeing the drug lord motionless in the pool. Arthur, now in chef's clothes, calmly left the kitchen, ran to the bridge, jumped onto a passing freighter, and escaped. The next day, Arthur sees the news of the drug lord's death. He changed into a man's costume to meet Harry, who was responsible for the payment. Harry was also his guide and could be described as a mentor and friend. After a brief chat, Arthur drove off with his earnings. He is known as the mechanic because he works on classified ads. Arthur is shocked when he sees his next target. It's Harry. He immediately calls headquarters to confirm and requests a meeting with Dean. At the private airport, Dean explains that Harry was involved in a leak. 6 months ago, they took on a big contract, but the 5 top assassins sent on the mission are dead. One of the assassins was someone Arthur knew. The mission fails due to an inside leak, and only Harry and Dean know about it a week ago. Harry's account suddenly had an extra $20 million in it. Dean's mention of Harry's son, a debt-ridden troublemaker, convinces Arthur of the suspicion. Dean then tells Arthur that if he refuses to carry out the mission, someone else will take over. Arthur hesitated, but finally called Harry. Upon receiving the message, Harry gathers his things, causes a power short with scissors, and rides the service elevator to the parking lot. When he arrives, however, his car has been destroyed. Before he can react, Arthur appears from the shadows. It is then that Harry realizes that Arthur has not come to his rescue, but has used his trust to bypass all the security measures, and the bullet holes in the car look to have become part of the carjacking. Before dying, Harry did not blame Arthur. He knew very well that since he had become a target, even if Arthur did not do it, someone else would come. He preferred to die at the hands of his own disciples and shot several times at the car door, just to help Arthur finish this accident, and then gave his most beloved pistol to the other party so that he could send him on his last journey. Arthur hesitated for a moment, but shot Harry anyway. On the day of paying tribute to Harry, he accidentally bumped into the rumored short-tempered Harry's son Steve, who was still a hobo, and said angrily that he would kill a few carjackers to relieve his anger. That night, Steve pulled into a secluded alley and waited for his prey. Shortly afterward, a young man knocked on his car window and asked if he needed help. Steve ignored him and lit a cigarette. To his surprise, the young man pulled out a gun. Realizing it was a car thief, Steve blamed him for his father's death and began beating him until he lost consciousness. Just as he is about to use his own weapon, Arthur appears and stops him. Arthur warns the thief to keep this quiet or he will come back for him. After that night, Steve becomes obsessed with Arthur. He knows about his father's business, and that Arthur was introduced to him by his father. Steve believes that his father chose Arthur over him, so now Arthur owes him. He wants Arthur to train him to be a professional killer, but Arthur firmly rejects him because he knows that Steve is too emotional for the business. At home, Arthur looks at the picture of Harry and thinks for a long time before finally calling Steve and deciding to give him a chance. The two meet an animal shelter. Arthur asks Steve to adopt a chihuahua and go to the same cafe for coffee every day for the next 3 weeks. Meanwhile, Arthur takes him out into the countryside every day to practice his marksmanship, and again makes him learn all sorts of things about insurance, the familiar causes of death that he must avoid if he wants to disguise it as an accident, and the two grow close, just as they were with themselves and Harry back then. In order to train better, Arthur simply asks Steve to move in. Arthur has 2 things other people cannot touch. One is his collection of classic cars, and the second is his vinyl records. A period of time, Steve finally ushered in the first task, and he wants to assassinate the person is actually a regular customer in the coffee shop. This person is also a mechanic turned to be a tainted witness, is protected, so it is very difficult to get close to, but he has 2 Achilles heels. That's right, the first is a chihuahua, and the second is a young guy. The reason why Arthur let Steve hold the pet to the coffee shop is precisely to lure the man on the hook. The innocence of the world of Steve, after a conversation, successfully won the other side of the trust. They then meet up at a bar together. While the man is leaving, Steve pulls the deadly toxin out of his pocket, a plan Arthur has for him. Just 6 drops and the other man will be dead in 20 minutes. However, Steve wants to finish his opponent cleanly as Arthur did and puts it back, then follows the burly man back to his place. Came to the strong man's home. The strong man has long been unable to hold back. Just when ready to make out, Steve suddenly wrapped the belt around his neck, but the target size strong slightly force will be Steve toppled, so the assassination into a life and death struggle. The strong man beat Steve back and forth. See, the situation is critical. Steve copied the table screwdriver to the strong man, crazy stabbing. But the strong body, even if the strong body was stabbed, countless knives are. Still a punch. Knocked Steve down, and then added a kick. Just as he grabbed a screwdriver and was about to finish Steve off, Steve grabbed the shovel hanging in the fireplace and slid it hard into the man's calf before knocking him to the ground, and despite the bruises, he finally finished the job. When Arthur accepts a new assignment, Dean warns him not to involve outsiders, even Harry's son. Arthur counters that he trained Steve as a personal agreement with Harry and has nothing to do with the organization. The new target is a self-proclaimed savior and cult leader who is heavily guarded but not invincible. The plan was to start with an injection of 12 milliliters of adrenaline, which would stop his heart within 3 minutes. When the ambulance arrives, the paramedics are utilized to administer a booster shot, which, when mixed with the adrenaline, becomes a lethal toxin. The two men installed a camera on the hotel wall by rock climbing to observe the target's movements. They then locate the target's room through the ventilation system and use a microtube for snooping. When Arthur pulls out the syringe, he discovers that the target has a drug habit, which will neutralize the poison. The plan fails, but Arthur doesn't give up. When the room is empty, Arthur changes his method and plans to suffocate the target. He pried open the target's mouth and Steve inserted the camera with the antenna. It was just a room away, and the bodyguards were unaware of it. A few minutes later, the target stopped breathing. After the two left the room, the head bouncer walked into the room and found the target dead. The bodyguards thought it was a drug overdose and called for help. Realizing that the cult leader was just a puppet controlled by a crime syndicate, they chose to remain silent as they were afraid to reveal the truth. Several people were about to carry the body away, but unexpectedly a screw was Steve accidentally dropped. Along the ventilation pipe rolled down to the room carpet. Although the movement is very weak, but still caused the bodyguard alert, Steve did not move to pull out a pistol through the mirror on the bodyguard. The bodyguard is about to remove the mirror. Steve also pulled the trigger. The rest of the people realized that the ambush by no means pull out the gun crazy shooting. C was forced into a corner. Arthur can only be forced to counterattack. Will be the other side knocked away. A few people have not reacted to it. It was Arthur hit a surprise. After forcing the other side, he hastily picked up the ground pistol toward the window and fired several shots, and then jumped to the glass a donkey roll to reduce the buffer, and then serpentine walking position side hit and retreat. Then 2 people to the rooftop to meet. They have long been here to plan the escape program. The rope will be tied to the railing on one end to the other and tied to the waist to try the degree of solidity to confirm that there is no error. Jump down to the building, accompanied by whistling wind. The 2 people fell quickly at the same time. The bodyguards also spared no effort to hunt down and kill, and constantly shot at them. But unfortunately, a gun did not hit. Arthur saw the right moment and jumped right in, smashing the glass on the window before pulling Steve to his feet. In order to avoid the bodyguards, the two decided to split up and use the evacuated crowd to blend out. However, when Arthur in the airport is ready to leave, but unexpectedly saw a familiar figure, obviously dead killer, at this time, but intact in front of the eyes, realized that something is wrong. Arthur decided to track the killer to find out, has been tracked to the bus, found that Arthur's tracking is not a surprise. The same as after strict training has long been put life and death outside of the world, in Arthur's pursuit of the truth of the murderer. It turns out that the betrayal of the organization is not Harry, but Dean, because Harry suspected that an action failed, intending to expose Dean, which was killed. Arthur was also forced to get involved. The murderer was ready to preemptively kill Arthur, after a fight was thrown out the window by Arthur. In addition to this, Arthur concludes that Dean is starting to decapitate and calls Steve to warn him. Unsurprisingly, Steve is surrounded by assassins, but luckily Arthur is prepared and hides a gun under the sofa cushions. Steve borrows a phone as cover and quickly returns fire, killing his opponent in return. Arthur returns to the lair, tells Steve to pack up his things, and uses a computer to find out the address of Dean's bodyguard. They arrive at the bodyguard's house, where Steve shoots him in the thigh and holds his wife and daughter hostage to force him to reveal Dean's location. The bodyguard refuses to betray his employer, but when Arthur threatens his daughter with a meat grinder, the bodyguard finally gives in. However, the daughter's finger isn't really hurt. Arthur just uses a bone as a trick. After Arthur forces him to reveal Dean's location, he calls Dean, who offers $10 million to end the matter. Arthur is unimpressed and says he's killed downstairs. Dean realizes the danger and calls in his men, but Arthur just changes the IP address to lure Dean out of the building to intercept. Realizing that bribes don't work, Dean offers a $10 million reward for Arthur's capture. Meanwhile, Arthur and Steve quickly pack up their guns and ammo and split up. Arthur installs cameras in the parking lot, then opens an old King sedan to watch Dean's convoy flee. Steve intercepts a bus, kicks the passengers off, and drives it to its destination. Seeing Dean's convoy leave through the camera, Arthur drives the sedan over the tail car of Dean's convoy, triggering a firefight. Dean orders his men to fight back, but is killed instantly. As the remaining bodyguards retreat, Arthur stops momentarily. His target is Dean. After taking out the bodyguards, Arthur gets into a tow truck and speeds off in Dean's direction. Steve drives the bus into them, triggering a collision and explosion. Steve opens fire on them, and Dean orders the driver to back up. But Arthur drives a garbage truck into them, flipping the sedan onto its side. Dean remains calm despite being held at gunpoint and taunts his opponents. As for what happens, it goes without saying how arrogant he is deserves to take the fire until the shell casings are scattered all over the place. After doing so, Steve asked him what his plans were, and Arthur didn't care, his look suggesting that he just wanted to enjoy his retirement with his big, beautiful girl. But the moment he turned his head, he inadvertently saw the pistol on Steve's waist that Harry had given him at the time. It turns out that when he was leaving the island, Steve packed up his things and inadvertently found his father's favorite gun, which was his favorite thing, and now it's in Arthur's trunk, and he probably knows that his father died at Arthur's hands, and when he was passing a gas station, he put the gas gun in the car to let the gas spill all over the place. Steve went around the corner and pointed his father's gun at the car, which exploded violently, and it was speculated that Arthur had been buried in the fire. Although Steve has avenged his father's death, he doesn't know where to go from here, and ends up back on the island with Arthur, who had previously instructed him that there were two things he couldn't touch here, and now he's going to touch them both. He took out the vinyl record to open the music and then listened to the pleasant tune to the garage, looking at Arthur's car. He slipped out of the gas, want to enjoy this hard one time, but do not want Arthur does not allow him to touch the thing is justified, because who touches these two things, who will have to die. The car was installed with bombs, and ultimately, not only the car blew up, the whole island is also submerged in a sea of fire. It turned out that Arthur is not even in the car. He sensed that Steve will be on their own, so in the other side of the gas, he quietly slipped out of the side door, thus avoiding the explosion. Nothing happened, continued to drive the car into the distance. Loneliness is his destiny as a killer. Well, this issue will be here. Everyone's attention is the impetus for me to continue to update. We'll see you next issue.